And all of that, everything that I just said, is not the main reason that we're valuable. These are all extras. I mean, the main reason is the transformative power of the arts themselves in the lives of children and citizens and of communities, something that each one of you has experienced yourselves.
Good morning. My name is Rod Joy, and I serve as Executive Director for Arts Alliance Illinois, your statewide arts advocacy and service organization. All right. All right. All right. 1 point for Michelle. The primary charge of the Arts Alliance is to elevate the presence and importance of the arts and arts education within the state and raise awareness that the contributions that artists make to society are just as important, if not more important, than the contributions of any doctor, lawyer, policeman, or fireman. On behalf of our statewide network of thousands of artists and arts advocates and hundreds of cultural institutions, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to our conversation this morning, Uniting for Impact, Arts Policy, and the 2012 election. In 372 days from today, on November 6, 2012, Americans will head to the polls to vote for the President of the United States and members of Congress. So what's at stake? What will the 2012 elections mean for the arts? The purpose of today's discussion is to highlight some of the key policy issues taking shape, discuss how federal proposals impact local artists and arts businesses, and identify action steps that advocates can take to advance arts policy. Now, even though today is Halloween, we don't want the 2012 arts forecast to be a horror story. Instead, our goal is to make the year ahead an action movie where individuals who care about the arts and arts education are informed, engaged, and involved. We'd like to recognize our event partners, the Americans for the Arts Action Fund and the Cultural Policy Center at the University of Chicago. Thank you for helping to organize today's conversation and for bringing together dynamic and knowledgeable thinkers at the forefront of the arts, public policy, and politics. I'd also like to thank the fairest and most balanced channel on cable television. That's right, CAN TV. Thank you for being here today to record our conversation and to share it with your network. So let's get started. To help set the stage for our panel discussion, I would like to bring to the stage someone who has more than 30 years of experience in the arts industry. He has been the driving force in ensuring that the collective voice of the arts community is heard louder, stronger, and clearer across the country. Please join me in welcoming President and CEO of Americans for the Arts Action Fund and Treasurer of the Arts Action Fund PAC, Bob Lynch.
Thank you all very much. It's really great to be here in Chicago. I've left the blizzards of Washington, D.C. for the warmth of Chicago, and we don't get to say that very often. And that's both, I think, weather and politics as well. So great to be here for the warm reception and the great crowd. What a wonderful turnout for this issue. But I think that it is expected when you come to Chicago, such a great arts city, such a great arts politics city. And a number of people who are here have worked with me on these issues over the years. Cheryl Ewan, Rock Schofer, Tom Tresser I know is here, the great Michael Dorff, who was instrumental when we did the work years ago with Sidney Yates. I thought I saw Benna Wilde and Deepa Gupta and Jennifer Armstrong, who was the first person to work with our emerging leaders, Aileen Valkanis, Ra Joy, fabulous people, Michelle Boone, who you'll be hearing from later, as well as Representative Jan Schakowsky. Great advocates for the arts all. I want to share with you some good news and some tough news. And I had the opportunity over the last year to testify before two House committees, Appropriations Committee that oversees the arts, and the Arts, Education, and Labor Committee that oversees arts education. And in both cases, it was a good news and a tough news story that I had to tell. The good news, you all know some of these kinds of figures, but the nonprofit arts, despite whatever we might read in newspapers and so on, are alive and well in America, thriving in tough circumstances. There's 109,000 nonprofit arts organizations. When the National Endowment for the Arts, as an example, began 45 years ago, there were 7,000. So we're a growth industry. There is a $166 billion economic impact just from those nonprofit organizations that generates 5.7 million jobs. That fact alone is one of our great calling cards in a time when everybody of every party is talking about jobs as a key thing. And those jobs return $30 billion in taxes, federal, state, and local. So we're a contributing part of this economy, cultural economy and national economy. But it goes a step further. All of the work that so many of you have done has helped spawn a huge for-profit arts industry. 550,000 for-profit arts organizations, whether it's a local music store or whether it's Broadway or the film industry or designers. That's a lot of jobs, and together, the nonprofit and for-profit, 4.2% of all businesses in America are arts businesses, art-centric businesses. In a time when we're trying to create more jobs and more work and more businesses, we are part of the solution to the problems, not part of the problem. And that key message, I think, is one that resonates, but it has to be repeated again and again. And all of this has grown steadily over the last half century. So we have people that do recognize this. We know that we're seen as the arts as a key partner in community smart growth by the League of Cities, for example. That we are seen as a cornerstone of tourism by the National Association of Counties, good friends. We are one of the 10 building blocks for a better communities and a better nation that the U.S. Conference of Mayors came up with in the last election. We are a partner in downtown and state revitalization, jobs, economy, the things that happen if you have a good economy, like the changing of the crime scene or homelessness or youth at risk. We are seeing today the arts as part of a solution that 50% of American hospitals are implementing because it saves money. People enjoy the surroundings, heal faster, get out quicker, and save dollars. So we are the best kept secret in America, the arts, as part of the solution to the broader set of issues and difficulties. And all of that, everything that I just said, is not the main reason that we're valuable. These are all extras. I mean, the main reason is the transformative power of the arts themselves in the lives of children and citizens and of communities, something that each one of you has experienced yourselves. I read a quote recently by Pablo Picasso. He said, "Art washes away from the soul the dust of everyday life." Okay, that's why we do it. But we also have all of these other wonderful things to add to the mix. And we have friends. Besides all of those organizations that I mentioned, we have friends like the wonderful Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky and the people that you will see on this quick 3-minute film that I want to show. So if you could roll that film.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for standing up, and speaking out for the arts.
This is exactly when you need to be here. You are the frontline troops. We don't need you when everybody agrees how important the arts are.
There are people who believe that the federal government or the state government or the local government has no business in funding arts. I respectfully disagree with him. I think the arts are an important part of communities that make communities more livable.
Everyone doesn't understand the importance of the arts to our civilization, to our country, to our economy, to our spirit.
That yearning for beauty and expression that we find reflected in the arts. Other than the opposable thumb, I think it's the defining thing that makes us as successful and unique species.
It is my firm belief that children who create do not destroy.
Without the arts, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings. Take wings to fly.
There's nothing more important to critical thinking than the development of arts and creative minds in early education.
It was when they found out what an incredible economic engine the arts are that they knew that they could not lose the National Endowment for the Arts.
Because when it comes to business, the number one thing they want is a creative mind.
You can come from anywhere, and that's what's exciting about music and the arts and all of the things that go along with an opportunity to use your God-given talents.
So whether you're a kid in school, whether you're the President of the United States, or you're a member of Congress, arts education and the funding of arts is extremely important.
When advocating for the arts, don't sell it short. Let them know how important it is, that it is defining of who we are.
We support the arts, not just for ourselves, for our future, and for generations yet unborn. So I come here to say thank you and never ever give up. Never ever give in. And standing up for the arts.
And the tough news is that the three funding sources for the arts, earned income, private sector, and public sector, are all challenged because of the economy. Earned revenue, 60%. People have less money, that's a challenge. Private support, donations, 31%. Less money flowing through corporate and foundation and individual coffers, and tax laws that are unhelpful are things that hurt the private sector. And then public sector, 9%. That's what the elections are about, mostly the federal, but also the state and the bigger money, the local money, all part of that 9%. So in the last years, we've seen 20% cuts across the board, all across arts organizations in America. But fewer arts organizations went out of business than most people thought because of the resilience of those organizations and their interest and willingness to be mission-driven, not bottom-line driven. So we still have a very, very large core of arts businesses in America. The challenge of this economy, however, is something that is not going to go away for a while. And so we have this in our arts sector to deal with over the next months and years. The research that we do shows, when we look at this funding, that the state funding follows the economy. The economy is tough. The local funding, to a lesser extent, follows the economy, but also community development helps to affect the investments that mayors and city managers are making in the arts. And the federal money often follows the political climate and ideology, and so the graphs for each of those look very, very much different. Our research also shows that your advocacy makes a huge difference. 45 years ago, no one thought there could be a National Council for the Arts. Our organization came into being at the time with people like you and lobbied to create the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. 15 years ago, few people in Washington thought that federal funding could be saved. It looked like it was going down the drain. And yet, with the advocacy and with the help of leaders like you, we were able to, with a large loss, however, retain federal funding and build it back up over the last decade to almost where it was back then. This year, you hear a lot of noise about what's happening at the state arts agency level. most of what you read about is bad, but you don't read that half of the state arts agencies either had an increased or flat budget. And almost all the rest, the cuts were within the margins of what other things, 4%, 3%, were being cut in those states. Only 4 had cuts of 25% or larger. That's because of the work of people like Rajoy and all of you and people like you all across the country. And I know some friends from Michigan are here as well. And what we see is these 80 groups across the country, these statewide groups, working with our 5,000 local arts agencies and the 300,000 people that we have on lists as citizen activists can make a really, really big difference. Good news tells us that the arts as a public good are a very, very good public policy investment. But the other thing that I've learned is that we have to constantly, the tough news tells us that we have to constantly make the case. Research, visibility, advocacy, leadership like you, organizations like the Americans for the Arts Action Fund and the Political Action Committee. Now, there's a lot that we'll have a chance to talk about as a panel. But as I look at the upcoming election, I see a couple of key things for us to think about. The elections are upon us, and the political pendulum in this country has swung dramatically in the last 2 election cycles. So the question is, what's going to happen in 2012, and how can we retain a core across the country that will be supportive of the kinds of key things that we care about? Issues like arts education, like tax policy, like arts funding policy, and like the elections themselves. On the education front, the Americans for the Arts Action Fund has been working to strengthen arts education in the next reform of our education, of our nation's education laws. And we have had some success in keeping things that the Republican-controlled House wanted to eliminate, arts education money, but not without a small loss. We need to get that back. We need to increase it. And 2 weeks ago, we had a Senate Education Committee approve a bill that could go a long way to addressing the key issue, which is the narrowing of the curriculum that sends money to things other than the arts at the local level. That has been a problem, pushing arts education out of classrooms all across the country. However, unless leaders in the Senate are retained or elected, we won't have that chance again in a future election. So the work of advocating for key leaders, good leaders who are sensitive to arts policy and have good arts policies themselves remains critical. On the economic development front, during the last jobs bill 2 years ago, we were able to work with you to generate 85,000 calls and letters and emails and get $50 million for the arts into that jobs bill, $50 million. And we can count the well over 3,000 jobs, the specific names of the people who got those jobs in that jobs bill. This works, and our sector works very well. We also were able to fight back an attempt to get the words art, museums, theaters out of the law. There was an attempt to say that you couldn't even be eligible. And it also included aquaria and zoos. And so we took on the challenge as advocates to get the words museums and theaters and music organizations to be left in there to be eligible. We took that on as our job because we're the arts organizations, and we did it. And the zoos and the aquaria were not able to do it separately, and so that's why none of them were able to get jobs money. To me, I wish they did, but it's a telling example of what you can do and how advocacy actually does work. And then on the federal arts funding front itself, difference couldn't be clearer, couldn't be more clear that the ability for us to advocate turns up real dollar differences. And right now, we're under a challenge. We have had $155 million. We lobbied for $167.5 in our advocacy efforts earlier this year at Arts Advocacy Day. The administration put forward a $20 million cut. That's pretty tough to deal with as the new floor. The House has tried to actually make further cuts, and collectively with great congressional leaders we were able to fight back on those cuts, but we're still in a kind of a limbo place. The Senate has just looked at possibly a $155 million mark, and so we're still looking at where that's going to go. But it continually comes back to people like you making the case. So that brings us to Arts Vote 2012, the elections that are coming up. Not only House and Senate races, and we will be looking at all of those, and our Political Action Committee also will be, and our report card that comes out every year that gives people an A, B, C, D, or F grade, also it will play into that. But in these presidential elections, we will be going after candidate responses and policy positions. We got 7 candidates last time to come forward with policy positions, and President Obama's position was the most comprehensive, and we're still pushing on all of those fronts. Some he has been able to accomplish, others are still there to work on. In the next month, we will be in Iowa, going there as the caucuses come closer. 3 days on candidate forums and other kinds of group meetings. We will be bringing this message to both the Democratic and the Republican conventions, and we will have forums that get to delegates, get to presidential candidates, and allow us to make sure that they know that there are 300,000, 1 million people out there that care and are watching. Now, I'm excited about the leadership here in Illinois. We were able, for example, to see that both U.S. senators are both great art supporters, and neither one is up for re-election in 2012, so that's great. The Illinois congressional delegation has one of the best statewide records of support in the arts in the country. 52% are members of the Congressional Arts Caucus, and 40% have an A arts voting record. And we were able to give 12 gifts over the last 2 election cycles to 9 congresspeople to show our support for their great arts investment. So with that, what can you do? What can you do, and how can you help us? And how can we help you? Well, I would suggest that everybody got a card. This is the card on the way in, and it allows you to sign up to be a free member of the Action Fund. And in partnership with what is happening here with the Alliance, you can get all of the national information and national calls for actions by being a free member. Remember, when we only had 100,000 people signed up for this, we were able to generate 85,000 calls to Congress, and we were able to significantly impact that jobs bill, which led to $50 million. Think of what could happen if we had 1 million people. Think of what we had if we had 1 million people that we could call upon. I think that the noise would be loud and strong and really, really important. So that's the first thing, join. Secondly, help us get congressional candidates to articulate their position on the arts before they get elected by filling out candidate arts surveys, which we have available online and directly from us and from RA. And finally, as we're conducting programs and presidential candidate forums in Iowa next month and training arts advocates on how to influence Iowa caucus platforms, if you know anybody that wants to help with that, with donations and so on, that is always welcome. So with that, this month is National Arts and Humanities Month. President Obama gave a strong proclamation that we were able to get him to do supporting arts and arts education at the beginning of the month. I went to forums like this one in Salt Lake City, in Palm Beach, in Fort Lauderdale, in Philadelphia. People are there who want to help. We convened key philanthropic and social change agencies at Sundance and coming up at our National Arts Awards recently and in Miami next month. Those people want to help. We brought together business CEOs from across the country at our Business Committee for the Arts Forum 3 weeks ago in New York City. Those business leaders say they want to help. 2 weeks ago, we brought military leaders together and health community leaders at a summit on the arts and wounded warriors, and those military leaders understanding the power of the arts and the healing process there, they want to help. Last week, the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies met in West Virginia, and I was there to talk to them, and they want to help. Independent Sector is meeting here in Chicago, as Grantmakers in the Arts did last week in San Francisco, and these leaders, many of them, we can pull in, and they want to help. 1,000 emerging leaders, young people across the country, are participating in 50 forums during this National Arts and Humanities Month, and they want to help. Together with all of those groups, many represented here, all of those sectors represented here, we can make a difference. We can get to 1 million Action Fund members. We can get to $250,000 of Political Action Committee money to give away. We can get to pro-arts elected leaders, federal, state, and local. And what we'll get is the gift of the arts in the lives of every American. And that's pretty good. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bob. Before we invite your questions, I'd like to introduce our panel. Since being elected to the United States Congress in 1998, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who has done more to advance the arts and arts education than the Honorable U.S. Representative Jan Schakowsky. Representative Schakowsky serves the 9th Congressional District of Illinois, which happens to be the same congressional district that was represented for 24 terms by the great Sidney Yates, and she takes that legacy quite seriously. Bob talked about the Americans for the Arts Congressional Report Card, and I'm pleased to report that Representative Schakowsky not only earns an A on every report card, she has consistently earned an A+. Please join me in welcoming Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky. All right, so she's been described by some close observers as the Derrick Rose of the arts community. She is truly one of the most creative and accessible people I know. For those of us who appreciate and support the arts, we couldn't have a better partner in City Hall than the one and only Commissioner Michelle Boone, the Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. Please join me in welcoming Michelle Boone. All right, that made my Halloween right there. All right. So,
I don't work for the foundation anymore.
all right.
You don't have to do that.
Hello to the other funders in the house. Well, I'd like to start with Congresswoman Schakowsky.
Okay.
I read a recent poll that the approval ratings for Congress are something like 7%. I'd like you to, and that's not you, it's Congress, but I'd like for you to, let's back up a minute before we dig into arts policy and just talk about political apathy or perceived political apathy that exists in America today, and why should people care about electoral politics and what's at stake in 2012?
Well, in terms of what's at stake, how about everything we care about? I believe that in many ways America is at a crossroads. And the decision about what kind of country are we going to be, what are our core values, really is at stake right now. I don't agree that there's an atmosphere of apathy right now. I think we're seeing a new narrative and a new rebirth of activism. I've been down several times now to Occupy Chicago and with a number of the more traditional activist organizations, unions, and advocacy groups, et cetera, that have gone down there. And I think that they are describing something that most Americans feel in their gut, this unfairness in our economy, unfairness in our country right now. We are the 99% kind of message, I think, is getting out. And it's focusing, I think, the attention on the right place. And that is Wall Street, a kind of corporatization of our government, and away from the notion that government is the problem. So I see a new activism building. We'll see how far that goes, but I hope that it is inspiring to those who are never going to go down to any of these rallies, but to say, yeah, there's something there. They're right. But let me just give you quick 3 examples of what is at stake and what kind of country will we have. One that has nothing to do with the arts. This week, I've accepted the food stamp challenge. And starting last Thursday, I've been eating on a food stamp budget, which is $31.50 for a week, or an average of $1.50 a meal. That's up from when I did it 4 years ago, $3 a day instead of $4.50 a day. But right now in the United States of America, about 48 million people, including 1 out of every 4 children in our country, is designated as food insecure. In the meantime, what we saw in the budget that was passed was a cut in the food stamp program. It's really now called the SNAP program, of $127 billion over the next 10 years. And a cut in the WIC program, Women, Infant, and Children, which is literally taking food out of the mouths of hungry children. This is all in the name of deficit reduction. I think this obsession with deficit reduction, cutting the budget, is yesterday's conversation. Today's conversation is about jobs, about stimulating the economy. And unfortunately, we're left with the super committee that's making decisions about cutting the deficit, which, by the way, could also be done with raising revenue. I'll hope to talk about that in a minute. But I wanted to directly talk about the arts programs. The House Interior Appropriations Bill that passed has a 20% cut in just the next 2 fiscal years for the National Endowment of the Arts. The FY12 budget funds both the NEA and NEH at $135 million. If you divided it equally among the states, that's about $2.7 million. I would like to call that amount of money budget dust. This is so small. So, for one thing, I think the arts community and its supporters need to think much bigger. I mean, $135 million is no money. And we're fighting, of course, to increase that, but even so, by small amounts. Next, I'd like to say that John Klein, who is chairman of the Education and Workforce Committee, has divided the ISEA, the school funding bill, into 3 parts, into 3 pieces. One is a bill to eliminate over 40 education programs, including art programs, just to eliminate them. Now, that one hasn't passed yet, but that would eliminate. So the idea that we can stand back and be in any kind of a state of apathy is just out of the question. It is unacceptable. Peggy Montez and I were talking, we've been around for a while. No retirements, nothing. Thank you, Peggy, and I know we're going to try and get you on the national, what is it called, committee?
National Endowment.
What is it called, Peggy? National Council for the Arts. Everybody, we're going to support Peggy for that. Anyway, a little lobbying here. So I think that the fight is on. I think that we have the numbers. I'm talking about people. And we have the strategies, which maybe I can talk about a little bit later, if we all work together. And Bob has done a good job in laying that out. So I'm not going to buy into the apathy thing.
Okay, great.
Okay.
I'll try again on another question. I'd like to bring Commissioner Boone into this conversation, and a lot of our discussion is focusing at what's happening in Washington at the federal level. I was hoping you could say a couple of words about how federal policy impacts local government.
Well, of course, it impacts local government in the way that it impacts all of us individually. I'm pretty inspired by the way Chairman Rocco Landesman has approached his role with the National Endowment for the Arts, in that he is trying to leverage resources within other federal agencies. And he was here back earlier this year announcing a partnership and collaboration with HUD around creative placemaking. And we're starting to see funding from those initiatives to roll out across the country and even here in Chicago. You know, there's an opportunity, I think, for Chicago that might be really unique for other cities in the way that our mayor, our public leader, has been so vocal about championing the arts. I mean, literally, once or twice a week I get a call, you know, Michelle, it's your mayor. And I'm scrambling, you know, to grab a piece of paper because I know there's going to be a litany of ideas, suggestions, or follow-up to conversations that we've had about how he can help really move the agenda forward. And for someone that is as high profile as Rahm Emanuel, I think it's not so much about Washington influencing us, but what kinds of ways we can use him to influence Washington and other city leaders or government leaders.
Fantastic. Bob, let's look backwards before we look forward. You know, obviously, you talked a little bit about Arts Vote 2012, but you launched a very successful campaign in 2008 around the elections that produced, among other things, you mentioned the Obama Arts Platform. It helped inspire that platform, and several people who contributed to that platform are here today. So whether it's commenting on the Obama Arts Platform or some of the separate policy initiatives that were included in your Arts Vote 2008 strategy, how would you rate progress from 2008 to today?
I would say progress is fair, and a lot of hope for it to be even better. And
let me say this, because Bob approached me right before the panel and said, hey, I recognize this is Obama's hometown. Can I speak my mind? And I think everyone would agree.
Yeah.
You can speak your mind.
Good, because I was prepared to say things are fabulous, but no. But I'll just, actually, before I go into that, I would just reference something that the Congresswoman said, which is ask for more, ask for something bigger. And that's what I think we try to do there, ask for some very big quantum leaps. And the jobs bill is a good example of that, because the jobs bill of 2 years ago, we asked for $1 billion. That was the ask that we put out there, $1 billion for the arts. And we got $50 million. Now, a lot of people thought we couldn't get anything, so $50 million is good, but $1 billion is much more, I think, reasonable and understandable. So that's the kind of thing that I think we have to constantly do on all of these fronts. With the Obama policy paper, the first thing is, I said before, it was the most comprehensive thing that had ever been done, which is great. And in being comprehensive, it put out some big thoughts. One was the creation of an arts corps. There are some things that are pieces of that have been tried within Jobs Corps and other community service, but that's still something that I think the arts community is hoping for. There were things like large leaps in investment in the federal agencies, NEA, NEH, and as I mentioned when I was up there was the proposal from the administration, OMB, for a $20 million cutback that you also mentioned as well. And so that's going the wrong direction. But But the good news is that there's a lot of emphasis on the arts in the White House, a lot of emphasis in various arts programs, on art forms being brought in there. There is the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities just came out with a great study on arts education, and so there's forward progress at the same time. And I think that the main thing there is that we have in that policy statement and in the leadership of President Obama someone who really cares about this issue, and the framework that we're working in, the economic framework, is I think hedging in some of the quantum leaps that could actually be there. So that's a quick snapshot analysis of some things that have worked well and some things that have a ways to go.
Great, and I'm glad you mentioned the Artist Corps concept. I had the pleasure of participating in the AmeriCorps program and completed 900 hours of national service, and it's really exciting to think about how that same kind of program could be used to marshal the resources of our artists and underserved communities and schools. And it's also a great way to create jobs quickly. I'd like to come back to the Congresswoman. I struck out on my first question. I didn't get you to agree. I'll try again. And I'd like to ask you about the Citizens United ruling and money in politics. Last week, Columbia College Chicago brought Donna Brazile in to speak as part of the Conversation in the Art series. And she mentioned that we will spend between $5 and $6 billion to elect our next president and Congress. You've always been a really strong proponent of the idea that people power trumps money power. With the Supreme Court's recent campaign finance decision, do you still feel the same way?
Well, it certainly has created another challenge for us. A terrible decision, as many of you know, by the Supreme Court that says that corporations are people when it comes to First Amendment rights, and they can contribute unlimited and virtually undisclosed amounts of money to not to individual candidates, but they can put ads on television. They can voice their opinions on the campaigns. So mostly it's the ads, and they get involved in races from the Wisconsin recall elections to judge races around the country, all the way up to the presidential elections. So this certainly does add another barrier for us to overcome. But I do think that look at the Tea Party. Of course, it was well funded, but the idea is we need to make politicians more afraid of us than of them. That's really the formula. That's really the formula. And I want to say something about the film. And what you showed was a bipartisan, mostly male, group of legislators.
I told you, Bob.
I'd like to feature you in the next one.
Yeah, fine. Okay. That we're talking about their support, and members have to own their votes. And you can say all you want at an event where people are going to clap for your support for the arts. And at the end of the day, if you vote for those cuts, you have to be held accountable. And some of those people who were expressing great support are the very people who voted to slash these budgets. And so I think that there has to be some cost to doing that. And hopefully the next time, if there is some sort of an onslaught, and here are a couple of my suggestions of how to do that. I was talking to Michael Dorff earlier about how in 1981, when there was to be a big cut in the NEA, that Sid Yates sponsored these incredible hearings, multiple hearings in Washington, where for the first time he brought in stars. Well, this movement, your movement, has star power as well, highly visible people. And I would suggest that a schedule of taking this show on the road, and they don't have to be formal hearings. You get a legislator or two, and you get some major film or music star to come and testify. And that kind of event, and then advocacy groups, artists who come and talk, and they could be in primary states around, or swing states around the country. The other thing is that members do measure input from their constituents in a very significant way. And if there are, if you would organize a virtual March on Washington so that the emails or phone calls came all in one day, that would tie up. I mean, I know when those things are happening in my office and the phones start ringing and it's all the same message. And it doesn't have to be that many, by the way. It really doesn't have to be that many before it really becomes noticed. So I think that those are just a couple of ideas how we maximize and magnify our power to get this, this message out. At the end of the day, Ra, I do believe that people power has the potential of trumping the money. In fact, the money can become a negative. When you start pointing out what certain members of Congress have received from certain donors, which is all public information, that can become a negative in their campaign. And people who have gotten most of their money from small donations or medium-sized donations, you know, can wear that as a badge of honor. And so I think it can actually cut both ways.
Great. And we want to invite your questions. But before we do, I just want to go back to Bob, because I know the Congresswoman made a couple of points that perhaps you want to respond to. You know, I think one piece is both sides of the aisle. And I know that you're a big proponent of engaging lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, all corners of the state. So that's one piece. And I think the other piece that the Congresswoman mentioned is star power and leveraging celebrities. And I know that you know, for National Arts Advocacy Day and for providing testimony, you've done a great job of engaging you know, Wynton Marsalis and Kevin Spacey and my personal favorite, Alec Baldwin. But maybe you could respond to a couple of those points before we open it up to audience Q&A.
Sure. Actually, first thing, I'll just go back to something that Michelle said, which was related to the other agencies of government, HUD and transportation, and that there's very visible things like National Endowment for the Arts, and where the money is very paltry, as you point out. And then there's other places where the arts can help and be supported. And an example in the jobs bill, for example, is that we also were able to get language into things that related to HUD and transportation, such that, and I'll use the city of Philadelphia as an example. The city of Philadelphia got $50,000 from the money that went, from the $50 million that went through the NEA. They got $50,000. They got $500,000 from HUD for arts programs that was related at the same time. So understanding the broader picture and understanding that we're part of a bigger ecosystem than just the arts themselves is key. On the bipartisan side, I mean, you have to be you have to look nonpartisan or bipartisan at the United States Congress, or you can't win anything because the majority switches back and forth. And so we are constantly looking for pro-arts leaders on both sides of the aisle. And the leadership pool on the Republican side of the aisle for the arts has gotten slimmer and slimmer. And the amount of votes, for example, that are mixed, where they might have voted well for something but not for something else, is another thing that we're having to look at. And so we try to celebrate when somebody does something well. And but at the same time, we put out things like on the Senate side, we put out a press release called the Dirty Dozen, which was senators who got an F rating for us. And interestingly, that kind of thing got the most pickup of anything that we did. Sadly, it should have been 21. There were 21 Fs. And but there was no movie called, The Dirty 21. So we couldn't go that way. The Dirty Dozen is what we went for. On the side of celebrity, I think it's a fabulous idea for us to try to find the people that we're working with now, mostly bringing them to Washington, and see if we can do some things out around the country in a bigger way. And we have an artist committee of about 100 that include the names that you mentioned. But an array of people from the visual art world and the literature world. And one of the things that I have discovered is that any political body is like a pie chart, and people have different interests. And so in some cases, it might be bringing a country music singer to a certain place. Nashville, we mentioned. We brought country music singers to the Republican National Convention last year. Or it might be bringing a key poet to a elected official who loves literature. And that strategy we've mostly used in Washington, and the idea of taking it more broadly, I think, is a great idea. So I think we'll try to work on that as well.
Fantastic. You mentioned the Dirty Dozen, and today is Halloween, and we talk about trick or treat, and our advocacy and communications director has a saying of thank or spank. And we often view our role of either thanking lawmakers who are doing the right thing or finding creative ways to spank lawmakers who are not quite there yet. We'd like to open this up to a couple of audience Q&As. Are we going to roving mics? As we get there, I'd like to pose a question for the commissioner. Bob Lynch has talked about Arts Vote 2012 and really seizing this election as an opportunity to move the needle on arts policy. We just wrapped up an election here in Chicago. You talked about the mayor's support for the arts. Are there ways for individuals to help shape arts policy here in Chicago?
Well, I was sitting here thinking that I wanted to take advantage of the opportunity and encourage everyone here to make a commitment now to participate in Arts Advocacy Day 2012. Out of the last 10 years, I think I've attended 8. And it is, you talk about people power. To have that contingent of arts advocates walking through the halls of Congress, the Capitol, meeting with their representatives and demanding that they be heard, pointing out the pending bills and legislations that are on the table, advocating for funding for the National Endowment for the Arts. First of all, it's a tremendous learning experience. I learn something every time that I go. The sense of camaraderie that you have to be a part of this national movement concentrated on this one day. And then also having the opportunity to have these face-to-face conversations with the people who are there to represent you. And you should know that other interests are there on a regular basis. And this is our one day of the year to be there and be a force. And thankfully, Illinois usually has about 10 to 15, but...
It's probably more than that.
Is it? All right, I'll give you that. Is it more than 30?
No, it's not more than 30.
It's not more than 30, so hey, you know,
Yeah,
between 12 and 30.
But you
We'll split up into
try to make
groups.
it look like
That's right. That's
But,
right.
I mean, wow, how powerful would that be to have, you know, 100 delegates from Illinois out there for Arts Advocacy Day?
And great plug in April 18th and 19th, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? April 16th and 17th. Let's take our first audience question. Jess or Mike, go for it. We'll come to you next. Go for it.
Hi, I'm Mike Latvist. I'm with ArtServe Michigan, the counterpart to Roz's organization in Michigan. And I hope this doesn't get us kicked out of the room, but we are home to Congressman Wahlberg, who did introduce the amendment to try and cut down another 10 or 20 million from what the House had recommended. My question is more, in Congress and then when we're in our communities talking to the candidates, sometimes we get faced with, look at the deficit that we're in, and, this really isn't a time to be funding the arts. And a lot of the times, especially with Congressman Wahlberg, It doesn't really matter about telling them about how many jobs we have or our return on the investment. I'd like to hear from you guys. How should we approach that? How do we try and change their mind? I mean, everyone has that point. I mean, what would be your recommendations as we go around the country and start talking to candidates?
Okay.
Go for it.
Well, of course, that's what we hear all the time, to cut programs that are enjoyed or needed by most Americans, ordinary Americans, and in this case, the arts community. The United States of America is not broke. I mean, that's a really important thing. And of course, Wahlberg is also against raising any taxes, especially on rich people. And I think that, I introduced a bill, the Fairness in Taxation Act, that would start at $1 million earners, not millionaires, $1 million yearly earners, and tax that at 45%, ratcheting up to 49% for people who earn $1 billion in 1 year. And there are Americans who do that would raise plenty more money than is needed to adequately fund the arts and the SNAP program, the food stamp program, and other things. So this very notion that we have to get the money from these essential programs is from the start just a fallacy. The other thing I was just thinking about is how valuable were the WPA art projects to the United States of America, where a lot of money was actually spent. We're valuing so much those photographs, those murals, all of the art that was done during this time, where that was during the Depression, during a time when there was so little money. And yet we spent money, the United States spent money on that because it did mean jobs. It also lifted the spirit. It was added to the sense of community and that America is still great, even though we're in a depression. I mean, the whole mindset, this cutting of these programs is cutting into the heart of the American spirit. It's hard to put that into words as much as forget it, get the money somewhere else. That's the other message. Get the money from rich people, most of whom, they just did a survey, most millionaire, rich people say, yes, tax me more. They really do. I have a whole group of people that, millionaires who are supporting my legislation, a few hundred of them, who say, yes, that's a good idea. And not because I'm a philanthropist to the government, because I know we rely on government.
Yep. And this is the start of a conversation that will continue throughout the year. And I strongly encourage all of you, if you haven't done so already, if you haven't filled out your postcard, to join the Arts Action Fund. It's free to join. It's a great way to stay informed about federal arts policy issues. We have time for one more question.
Good morning. It's not so much a question, but as a thought. I'm listening to the Congresswoman talk. I wonder if it isn't time that we not only advocate to our politicians and have politicians have arts policies, but we take a page from our own lives and go after the people. If the congressman will listen to their constituents, if we change the mind of the constituent, then we would change the mind of the politician. And maybe our advocacy should be broader beyond just the political action of the time, and let's form our own super PAC and add ads on TV, for example, using the statistics that you talked about earlier, so that we're broadening the whole scope of letting the country know, because I think we're doing a real poor job of telling the country the real value that the arts bring to this country. And my own little pet peeve, a great nation does not deserve great art. Great art makes a great nation. And that's what we need to be advocating.
Well said. Do you have a response?
Yep. So I agree, absolutely agree, and I think that the arts are storytellers, but we don't tell the story well enough. We don't tell it enough, and so the ability to get that story out is critical. Now, the other thing I learned about communications is there's no such thing as too much, and here's an example. We actually had an ad campaign called Art Ask for More that had over $300 million worth of donated advertising because of how we did it with the Ad Council, which is extraordinary. 45 full-page ads in the New York Times all across the country. Not enough. It has to be more, and it has to be actually organic and out. Now, we have a network of 5,000 local arts councils across the country, and finding a way to integrate a broader campaign to the people is key. I think that one of the problems is that the arts are something that people internalize, but they don't necessarily think of it as art. I think I'm at the point now of trying to name things as art. At my military event, Purple Heart. Well, the Purple Heart is a piece of art, and the bridges that are done with public art involvement are beautiful and decorative and welcoming, but they're art, and so on. And we need to name these things. And I want to swing back to the Michigan question too, because you know, there are people who get it and people who haven't had the epiphany. Let's put it that way. So I have my one-third, one-third, one-third proposal. It's a time for those kind of proposals, you know. And my one-third, one-third, one-third is you take a look at any body, elected body, and the numbers are slightly off, but one-third of the legislators are people like you, for example, or Ted Kennedy, or people who've had the epiphany of the arts in their lives, some moment that changed them as people because of how they engaged with a piece of art. You don't need arguments because they get it and they know that it should be part of society. And then you have one-third who they're not quite sure, and those people need another kind of a public policy argument, jobs or some kind of a connection to youth at risk or something else that tells the story for them to make a public policy decision. And then there's the third that will never get it, and you just need to work to defeat them and get rid of them.
All right.
All right. You know, why don't you do some sort of a contest? I mean, we're talking to artists of the most creative video to express, because if you have something really good, it can go viral without spending a whole lot of money to, you know, anyway, my thought of what you should do.
And obviously, this is a topic that we could talk for days and days about. This is the start of a conversation. We look forward to continuing this conversation with you at the table over the coming weeks and months. I invite you to please join me in thanking our wonderful panel, Bob Lynch, Jan Schakowsky, Michelle Boone.
And can we thank Rod Joy, who I have a certain actually maternal feeling for. He worked for me for 6 years. Can we thank Rod Joy for his...
Two other quick words of thanks. Thank you to the Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events for hosting this conversation today. And most importantly, thank you for being here today and for all that you do to contribute to a creative state. Thank you for being here.